The porch board had a groan in it, third one from the top, and I knew that groan the way you know a man's cough in the next pew. So when it came just before dawn, one long note under a slow wait, I set down my sanding block before Boone even lifted his head off the floor. The lantern threw its yellow across the fresh-cut plank I'd been smoothing for the bridge. The shavings curled pale on the bench, and I stood there in the shop with my ears open. Then the hound growled, low. Not the growl he gives a coon, but the softer one. Uncertain, the one that means a person where a person hadn't ought to be. I went to the door and opened it, and there she stood at the top of my steps with her shoes in her hands. She was soaked to the knee and past it, her skirt gone black with creek water and hanging heavy. And she held those two little shoes against her front the way you'd hold something you were afraid to drop. Dark hair come loose and stuck to her cheek. She was shivering so hard I could hear her teeth, but she stood straight as a fence post, and she looked at me and didn't say one word of who she was or how she got there or what she wanted. Just looked at me, waiting to see what kind of man was on the other side of the door. I have thought since about all the things a man might say in a moment like that. I didn't say any of them. I stepped back and swung the door wide and said, "Come in out of it." And she came. Boone got up and moved aside for her, which he does not do for most folks, and she came past me into the warm and stopped like she'd used up the last of what she had getting to the top of the steps. I shut the door on the gray cold. The stove had good coals in it from the night, so I opened the damper and fed it 2 splits of dry oak, and it caught and started to talk. I pulled the good chair around close to it. "Sit down there," I said. "I'll put the kettle on." She didn't sit. She stood by the chair with the water running off her hem and pooling dark on my board floor, and she held that satchel. I saw now it wasn't just shoes. There was a leather satchel slung crossways under her arm, and her hand was clamped over the flap of it. She held it against herself like a woman holds a sleeping child she won't be talked into laying down. I let her be. A body that's scared, you don't crowd. I filled the kettle from the bucket and set it on the eye of the stove, and I took Ada's shawl down off the peg where it had hung 12 years going gray, and I didn't make anything of it. I just held it out. "This'll be warmer than what you've got," I said. She looked at the shawl, and something moved across her face, and she took it in one hand, keeping the other on the satchel, and drew it around her shoulders. It was gray wool with a blue thread run through the border, and Ada had worn it thin at the elbows. Seeing it around another woman's shoulders put a strange soft ache in me I hadn't looked for. I turned back to the stove so as not to stare. The lantern was still burning on the bench, and when I reached to trim it, the light came across the back of my right hand, and I saw her eyes go to it. The scar there is an ugly thing, puckered and shiny, the skin drawn up wrong from the wrist to the knuckles, and it catches the light in a way that makes folks look and then look away. She didn't look away. She looked at it plain, and then she looked at my face, and I believe that was the moment she decided she was safe, though I could not tell you why a burn scar would do it. Maybe a person who's been marked can tell another one. The kettle came up to a mutter and then a whistle. I had tea, the black kind Della Foss sells in the paper twists, and I made it strong the way you make it for a body that's cold to the bone. I put plenty of the tin of condensed milk in it and more sugar than I'd take myself, and set the cup in her free hand. And I said, "Drink that. Don't talk yet. Just drink it." She drank it. Her hand shook so the cup rattled against her teeth, but she got it down, and I watched the warmth of it move into her a little at a time, the way you watch frost go off a window when the sun finds it. Boone lay down across her feet, which were bare on my cold floor, her stockings soaked through, and he put his old heavy head on her ankle and sighed like he'd taken on a job. I fetched a dry pair of my wool socks, the smallest I had, which were still great clumsy things on her, and set them by the chair, and I turned my back while she worked her wet stockings off and pulled them on. When I turned around, she had finally sat down, the satchel in her lap, both arms around it now, and she was looking into the fire. "I'm obliged to you," she said. Her voice was low and even, schooled, the voice of a woman used to being listened to when she talks, though it was worn thin just now. "I'll not stay long enough to be a trouble." "You're no trouble sitting in a chair," I said. I took my own stool by the bench and did not face her straight on, because it's easier for folks to talk to a man who's half turned away, working at something. I picked up the sanding block again and ran it easy along the plank, back and forth, and the small, dry sound of it filled the quiet so she wouldn't have to. After a while she said, "You haven't asked me how I come to be at your door before light with my shoes in my hand." "No," I said. "Most men would. I expect they would." I blew the dust off the wood and looked at the grain. "You waded the ford," I said. "Not the road. The ford's under 3 feet of brown water this morning and running hard. I heard it in the night. So you came the way nobody'd think to watch. That tells me most of what a question would." I set the block down. "The rest is yours to tell or keep. Makes no difference to the T." She was quiet a spell. The fire snapped. Outside the window the black was going to gray, and the first birds were trying their voices in the wet. "My name is Miriam Cole," she said. "I teach the district school. The little white one past the Foss store, if you know it." "I know it. I hung the door on it 2 winters back. It sagged. It doesn't sag now." A small thing, almost a smile, went across her mouth and was gone. "I board with Della Foss, above the store." She turned the cup in her hands. "My father was the doctor here, Dr. Cole. He died in February a year past." "I recollect it," I said, and I did. There'd been a hard sickness come through in the cold months, and the doctor had gone from house to house through it until it took him too, and half the county had turned out to bury him in ground so froze they'd had to build fires to open it. He set a boy's arm for me once. Neighbor boy. Wouldn't take a cent for it. "No," she said, and her voice caught on the word and steadied. "He wouldn't. That was the whole trouble with him, if you want to know. He never took the cent. He'd doctor a family all through a winter and forgive the bill because they'd lost a cow, or the roof went, or the man was drinking and the children needed shoes worse than my father needed paying. He kept his books faithful. Every visit, every night he sat up, every dollar owed, and then across the most of them he'd write a word." She stopped. "What word?" I said. "Forgiven." She said it soft. In his own hand. Forgiven. He'd write it and rule a line under the debt, and that was the end of it, in his mind and in the sight of the Lord. He died thinking he'd left nothing but goodwill and a daughter who could keep herself. Her arms tightened on the satchel. He left one thing more he didn't know about. He'd borrowed, in a bad year, against the house and the office, from the bank. It was a small sum and honest, and he'd have cleared it in time. But the note was bought. "Bought," I said. "A man in this county buys things," she said. "Buys the mill, buys the mortgages, buys a man's note out from under the bank at a discount because the bank would rather have the cash than wait on a dead man's estate, and once he holds the paper, he holds it over you." She looked at me then, straight, and her eyes were dry now, and very steady, and that steadiness was worse than crying would have been. "He means to collect me, Mr. Hartwell," I said. "Silas, he means to collect me, Misty, Hartwell, not the money. He's told folks I'm his ward, that my father put me in his care, which is a lie. He's told other folks I'm his intended, which is a worse one, and one I never gave him leave to tell. He speaks of it the way you'd speak of taking a lien on a piece of ground, as though a woman were a debt that fell due, and he'd come around to settle the account. Her chin lifted. I would sooner wait a flood in the dark than stand still and be handed across a table like a deed. So I waited it. I sat with that a minute. The kettle had gone quiet. Boone's tail thumped once against the floor in his sleep. "Well," I said finally, "you waded to the right door, whether you knew it or not. There's a loft room over this shop. It's got a bed in it and a window that looks at the creek, and nobody's slept in it since my wife passed, God rest her, 12 years back. It's dry and it's yours, as long as you've a use for it." I stood and went to the stove and moved the kettle to keep it from scorching dry. I'll tell you the same thing I'd tell any soul come out of the cold. You owe me nothing. Not the room, not an answer, not a reason. You can walk out that door whenever the notion takes you, and I'll not think the less of you nor ask where you're bound. A roof's a roof. It don't come with strings on my account. She was looking at me in a way that made me busy myself with the damper. I am not a man who's been looked at much, and never like that, like I'd said something that mattered when all I'd done was offer a room that was standing empty anyhow. "You don't know me," she said. "I could be anything. A thief, for all you can tell." "You could," I agreed. "You've got the manner of a schoolteacher and the hands of one, all inked up, and you're guarding that bag like it holds the crown jewels or your own heart, and neither of those is the way a thief carries herself. But say you were." I shrugged. "I've got a plank half sanded, a hound, and a wife's shawl on a peg. There's not much here to steal that a body couldn't have for the asking." She didn't answer that. She drew the shawl closer and turned back to the fire, and I let the morning come up around us slow and gray, and let the silence be a kindness instead of a question, and for a while there was just the fire, and the wet birds, and the smell of soaked wool drying. It was near mid-morning, and I had her sitting to a plate of fried mush and a second cup of that tea, and some color come back into her, when Boone lifted his head, and this time it was the coon growl, the hard one, and I heard it too. Hooves on the lane, iron shoes and a good clip, and the light jingle of a rig with money in it. Not a farm wagon, something polished. Miriam went white. Not pale, white, all at once, the color dropping out of her like water out of a cracked jug, and her hand went flat on the satchel. "Stay in here," I said, low, "sit still. Boone, stay by her." The old hound understood me and got up and set himself between the chair and the door, and I went out onto the porch and pulled the shop door to behind me and stood at the head of my steps the way she'd stood, only dry, and with my scarred hand hooked in my belt. The trap that came up my lane was black and waxed till it threw the sky back at you. A good bay horse in the shaft stepping high, and the man that held the lines wore a coat that had never seen a day's work, and a hat brushed smooth as a cat. He drew up neat at the foot of my steps, and he smiled up at me, and the smile was the smile of a man who has never once in his life been told no and meant to keep the streak going. "Morning," he said. "You'd be Hartwell, the bridge man." He looked past me at the shop, at the door, easy, taking his time, like a man appraising a property he's half decided to buy. "Alton Reeves. I have the woolen mill down on the kettle. Perhaps you know it." "I know whose it is," I said. "Then we needn't waste the pleasantries." He set the brake and stepped down, unhurried, and stood there settling his coat, and he had a cane with him, black wood with a silver head worked like a lion, and he leaned on it in a way that told you he didn't need it to walk. I'm looking for a young woman. My ward, Miss Cole. She left the Foss place before light in some distress. Poor girl's been under a strain since her father passed, not always herself, and someone thought they'd seen her come up this way, along the creek. He smiled again. I'd not have troubled you, but the water's up. A man worries. Nobody's here but me and the dog, I said. He looked at me a long moment, still pleasant, and I saw his eyes go to my hand, to the scar, and something flickered there. Recognition, maybe. There'd been a fire at a mill years back, before it was his, and I'd been one of the men that went in after a boy trapped in it, and I'd come out with less than I went in with. He'd know that story the way he'd know the deed to the land it happened on. You've a kind face, Hartwell, he said, so I'll speak to you kindly. That young woman is not right in her mind about her situation. Her father died owing me a considerable debt, and he left her provided for in the only way an honest man in arrears can, in my care. There are papers, a note signed and witnessed that makes her my responsibility and, I'll tell you plainly since we're being plain, my intended. It's all quite settled and quite lawful. He turned the cane slow in his fingers. A woman in her distress may run to any door that opens. That doesn't make it her door. And a man who shelters what isn't his? Well, the smile stayed, but the eyes went flat as pond ice. That's a costly kind of charity. Property is property. The law's the law. I'd hate to see a decent tradesman find that out the hard way over a misunderstanding. She isn't a note to be called in, I said. My voice came out quieter than I felt. And she isn't here to be fetched. That's the whole of what I've got to say to you. He studied me. Then he laughed, short, and put his foot back up on the step of the trap. Founder's Day, he said, gathering his lines. Day after tomorrow, the whole town turns out to dedicate that fine new covered bridge across the Kettle. Your bridge, I'm told. Handsome work. Judge Pruitt will be there, and the Reverend, and every soul in the district in their Sunday best. He settled the hat. These matters are best settled in the open, before witnesses, where everyone can see what's lawful and what's not. I'd invite you to come. I expect I'll have my ward on my arm by then, one way or another. It would be a pity for your grand day to be spoiled by a scene. He touched the silver lion to his hat brim. Good morning, Hartwell. Think on what you're holding. It's heavier than it looks. He backed the bay and swung the trap and went off down the lane at that same high clip, and I stood on my steps till the sound of it was gone into the trees, and even then a while longer, and the cold came up out of the ground into me. When I came back inside, Miriam was standing. She'd heard it all through the thin door. I saw that on her face. She had the satchel off from around her and open on the table, and her ink-stained hand was flat on a stack of papers gone soft at the edges from the damp ledger pages, ruled in columns, close written in a firm, slanting hand. That's him, she said. It wasn't a question. That's him, I said. She looked down at the pages under her hand, and she was a long time speaking, and when she did her voice had gone very low, the way a voice goes when it's carrying more than it wants to. These are my father's books, she said. Every debt, every dollar, and every line he ruled and wrote forgiven under, in his own hand, dated the winter before he died, including the ones Alton Reeves swears are still owing and mine to pay with my person. Her fingers pressed the paper flat. He has a note, Mr. Hartwell. I've seen it. He waves it about. And there's something written on that note, down at the bottom, in what he'll say is my father's hand, that my father never in his life set down. That's the thing I couldn't say out loud in your warm kitchen with your kind tea, because saying it makes it real. She raised her eyes to me, and they were steady again. Steady and terrible. I didn't just run from him. I ran with the one thing that can undo him. And in 2 days he means to stand up in front of the whole town, on your bridge, and make his lie the truth before God and Judge Pruitt both. She drew a breath. So I suppose, she said, we had best decide what an honest man's ledgers are worth against a rich man's word. I pulled out the other chair and sat down across from her, and I turned the lantern up though it was daylight, because we'd want to see every line, and I looked at the first page of her father's careful hand. Show me, I said. Boone knew her by then, and that is worth saying first, because a hound like Boone does not warm to a stranger inside 2 days unless something in the stranger is honest. He had taken to lying across her feet under the table while she marked her pupils' slates by lamplight, his old bones easing down with a groan, and she would rest one ink-stained hand on his head without looking up from her work. I watched that more than once and thought a man could learn a good deal about a person from the way a dog settled near her. The morning after she came, the creek was still high but falling, brown and loud through the willows, and I took her down to the ford to show her where a body could cross safe if it ever came to that again. Not because I meant her to leave, because a woman who had waded a flood in the dark ought to know there was a shallow bar of gravel 40 rods upstream where the water never ran past your knees, and I could not stand the thought of her going into the deep race again for want of somebody telling her. She stood on the bank in Ada's shawl with her mended shoes on her feet, and she listened to me the way she must have wanted her pupils to listen to her, grave and full attention, and when I finished she said, "You would have made a fine teacher." Miss Hartwell. I told her I had never taught anybody anything but how to true a beam. And she said that truing a beam and truing a child were not so different. You only had to be patient and mean it. I have thought about that since. She set my house right without ever making a show of it. I am a tidy man in my shop and a careless one in my kitchen. And by the second evening my shelves were ordered, the tins turned label out, the clutter of 12 years of living alone gathered and made sensible. And she did it so quiet I did not notice till I reached for the coffee and found it where a sane person would keep it. Ada's shawl had a tear along the fringe that I had never had the heart nor the skill to mend, and I came in from the shop to find Miriam working a needle through it by the stove, her head bent, drawing the wool back together stitch by careful stitch. She looked up like I had caught her at something. "I hope you don't mind," she said. It was coming apart. I did not have words for what I minded and what I did not, so I only said no. I did not mind, and I went and put the kettle on to have something to do with my hands. But I will tell you the truth of it. Watching her mend that shawl did something to a place in me that had been boarded up so long I had forgotten the room was there. It was not a thing I could have said aloud. I am not a man who says such things. I put the kettle on instead. It was that same night the worst of it came out. We were at the table with the ledgers open between us, the way we had been each evening, and the lamp guttered low, and she stopped turning pages and pressed her hand flat on one of them like she was holding it down against a wind. "There is a part I have not told you," she said. I waited. I have learned that waiting is most of what a frightened person needs. "The debts are nothing," she said. "My father forgave half of them at the bedside. He'd write a man's account paid in the ledger and take an egg or a cord of wood or nothing at all, because the man was poor and sick, and my father could not sleep otherwise. It is all here, in his hand, dated. Alton Reeves bought those notes from the bank for pennies. knowing most were already settled, and it does not matter to him that they were, because the debts were never truly what he wanted. She turned the ledger and slid a single loose page across to me, laid over the top of it a second page in the same brown ink. He wanted this. I am no scholar, but a man who works with his hands all his life learns to see when a joint is false, when a board has been let in that does not belong, and I saw it the moment I laid the two pages side by side. Her father's hand ran even and easy. The letters leaned all one way like grass under wind, the numbers made plain, and on the second page, low down under an honest line of the doctor's writing, somebody had added a clause. It leaned wrong. The ink sat different on the paper, blacker, newer, not sunk in the same. It spoke of a pledge, of a daughter promised in settlement of the estate, of Miriam Cole given over in marriage to the holder of the note, and it was signed with her father's name in a hand that had tried to be his hand and was not. He forged it, she said, and her voice was steady, but her hand on the table was not. He wrote my father's name. He means to stand up at the dedication, before the judge and the reverend and everyone, and read it out as though it were law, and dare a single soul in that town to say him nay. And they won't. You don't know how they fear him, Mr. Hartwell. He holds paper on half the county. A man who says no to Alton Reeves finds his note called due the next morning. She looked at me. I ran because I would rather have drowned in your creek than stood there and let him hand himself my father's name and me along with it. I sat a while with that. The lamp popped. Boone sighed in his sleep by the stove. You didn't drown, I said finally, which was a foolish thing to say, but it was what I had. You came up my steps instead. I did, she said, and something in her face eased the smallest bit. Then we'll take your father's own honest pages, I told her, and we'll lay them down next to his lie, and we'll let the town look at the two of them together the same as I just did. A forgery is only strong in the dark, Miss Cole, same as a bad joint. You bring it out into the light and set the true one beside it, and any fool can see which one'll hold weight. She looked at me a long moment. You believe it will be that simple? No, I said. I believe it's right. That's a different thing from simple. But I've spent my life on the notion that a true thing built plain will outlast a false thing dressed up fancy, and I am too old to stop believing it now. We sat late. Somewhere in there she told me about her father, the doctor going out in the January dark to a birth or a fever, coming home blue with cold, never once weighing whether the family could pay. She told it like she was afraid I'd think him a poor manager, and maybe he was. But I told her a man remembered in a county for what he forgave is richer buried than Alton Reeves will ever be standing up. And she told me, quieter, that she had begun to think there were no such men left, men who gave and asked nothing, until a hound growled at a door before dawn, and the door opened anyway. I did not know what to do with that, so I told her the truest thing I knew, which was the smallest. I'm nobody much, Miss Cole, I said. I want you to understand that plain, so you don't hang too much on me. I fix bridges. I mend barns. When Ada died, I stopped being anybody's anything, and I made my peace with it. And I've been 12 years a man the town nods to and forgets before he's out of sight. That's the whole of what you've got standing between you and Reeves. A carpenter nobody's thought about in years. She was quiet, and then she said a thing I have carried since like a stone smooth from handling. A man who opens his door at dawn to a stranger and puts his own dead wife's shawl over her shoulders and never once asks her why, she said, is worth more than the mill and every dollar in it, and more than the man who owns them. You've decided you're nobody, Miss Hartwell. You're the only somebody I've met in a year. I could not answer that. I got up and banked the stove. Founder's Day came up clear and cool, the maples just beginning to color along the ridge. They had built the whole day around the new bridge, my bridge, the covered span I'd raised across Miller's Creek that spring, hand-hewn oak and a shingled roof, red as a barn, meant to carry that county's wagons another 100 years. There was bunting strung along the portal and a plank table set at the near end with a white cloth, and the whole town came. In wagons and on foot, the children let out of school for it. Della Foss with her store shut for the day, Reverend Ames in his black coat, and old Judge Pruitt down from the circuit, stooped and slow, but with eyes that still saw clear. I stood off to the side in my good coat feeling like a fraud, because a man ought not be honored for doing the work he was made for. Miriam stood near me with her satchel, and I felt her go stiff before I heard the trap. Alton Reeves came up the lane behind a matched pair, silver head of his cane catching the sun, and he did not hurry, because a man who owns the county does not hurry. He climbed down and came through the crowd, and the crowd opened for him the way water opens for a stone, and I watched faces go careful all around. He walked right up to the plank table like it had been set for him, and he turned and smiled on all of us. "Neighbors," he said, "a fine day and a fine bridge, and I'll not keep you from the dedication long, but there's a matter of law wants settling first, and I'd as soon settle it honest before the judge and God and all of you, as have it whispered." He let that sit. Then he drew a folded paper from his breastcoat, slow, enjoying it. "Miss Miriam Cole is ward and promised bride to me by the estate of her late father, Doc Cole, God rest him, and I hold the pledge in his own hand." He looked at me then, straight at me, and the courtesy in his face had a knife under it. "And she's been sheltered these 3 days by this carpenter, who I don't doubt meant kindly, but who's kept from me what the law says is mine to keep. I'll have her home now, and no hard feelings, and we'll get on with honoring Mr. Hartwell's fine bridge." There was a silence you could have driven a wagon through. I felt the whole town wanting to look at their shoes. I opened my mouth, though I did not yet know what I would say, and I did not have to, because Miriam stepped past me before I could. She walked to the plank table with her satchel against her chest the way she'd held it that first dawn, and she set it down, and she opened it, and she began to lay her father's ledgers out on the white cloth, one and then another, flat and open, in the sun where every soul could see. "You hold a paper," she said to Reeves, and her voice did not shake now, not at all. "Here are my father's own. Judge Pruitt, I ask you only to look. All of it is in one hand, sir, my father's hand, all but a single clause, and I ask you to find that clause and tell this town whether the man who wrote the rest of it wrote that." The judge came forward. He was an old man, and it took him a moment, and nobody breathed. He put on his spectacles, and he bent over the ledgers, and then he took the folded paper out of Reeves's hand, and Reeves let him have it, because in that moment even Reeves could not think how to stop a judge from reading. Pruitt laid the forged note down beside the honest pages, the same as I had at my own table, and he looked from one to the other a long, long while. "Della Foss," the judge said, without looking up. "You knew the doctor's affairs." Della came up, twisting her apron, but her voice when it came was firm. "I knew them, Judge. He forgave the Tully account in my own store, said so to my face, wouldn't take the money when Tully tried to pay it. Same with the Boyds. Same with half this note Mr. Reeves is waving. Those debts were dead and buried before the doctor was." She looked around at the crowd, gathering herself. "I've held my tongue on a lot in this town for fear of that man. I'm too old to hold it today. And this line, Pruitt said, and he set one crooked finger on the forged clause. This pledge of the daughter. Doctor, is this your hand? He asked it of the dead man, almost, and then he answered it himself, his old voice carrying flat and final down the length of my bridge. It is not. The letters lean against the grain of every other line on the page. The ink is a season newer if it's a day. This is a lie written over an honest man's name. He straightened as far as his back would let him, and he looked at Alton Reeves, and there was nothing of fear in him at all, only the cold of the law. You brought a forgery before this court, sir. I hold this note void, wholly and every part, and you'll answer for the making of it. Sheriff, I'll want him held. And then the strangest thing. The fear broke. You could feel it go out of that crowd all at once, like a held breath let go, and the faces that had been careful turned, and there was a low sound in them that was not quite anger and was not quite cheer, and was somehow both. Reeves's smooth face came apart. The courtesy went first, and under it was just a mean and frightened man, and he said something about calling notes due, about ruining every one of them, and not a soul flinched, because a man is only feared so long as the fear holds, and his had just broke in front of everybody on the floor of my bridge. He was still talking when they walked him off it. Miriam stood at the plank table with her father's honest pages open in the sun, and she did not weep, and she did not gloat. She only gathered her ledgers back into her satchel, careful, one at a time, the way you'd handle something living. And the town looked at her different than they had an hour before, and looked at me different too, though I could not have said what I'd done but stand there. Reverend Ames dedicated the bridge after all, once things had quieted, and he said some kind words over it. And then he said a thing I did not expect, that a bridge was a fitting place for the day's truth to have crossed over on, being as a bridge was built to carry folks from a hard bank to a safer one, and that Silas Hartwell had built better than he knew. Folks came and shook my hand. It was the most of them had spoken to me in years, and it should have felt strange, and it did. But under the strange there was something warm I did not have a name for. Now I'll tell you how it settled, because it did not settle all at once the way a story wants to, with a wedding and bells. Life is slower and better than that. Miriam kept boarding at the Foss place, and she kept the school, and she stood before the county now as her father's honest daughter and no man's chattel. And that was worth more to her than my roof, and she was right that it was. Reeves answered to the law. The mill passed to better hands in time. The notes he'd held over half the county came to light, and most of them, like the doctor's, were found already paid. The fear he'd farmed for years grew nothing after that. But of an evening, more often than not, come the blue part of dusk when the work is laid down, I would hear a step on my porch, and Boone's tail would go before I was even up from my chair, thumping the floor, and there she'd be at the top of my steps, with her shoes on her feet this time, come by the road, dry and easy, by her own choosing, of an evening, because she wanted to and for no reason harder than that. Sometimes she brought her slates to mark by my lamp. Sometimes we only sat. The shawl she'd mended stayed on the peg by the door, and she'd take it up against the cool without asking now. And I liked that she did not ask. I have turned this over a good many nights since, being an old man with time to turn things over, and here is the plain sum of what I've made of it. The world is full of worth it walks right past. It walks past the doctor who forgives a debt in the dark and dies owing money he was owed 10 times over. It walks past the woman who'd wait a flood before she'd be handed to a man like a deed, and it walks past a graying carpenter who fixes bridges and thinks that's the whole of him, the whole of his account, till a hound growls at a door before dawn. We are none of us as small as the world's hurry makes us out to be. There is a kind of worth that never announces itself, that puts the kettle on instead of making a speech, that opens a door and asks no questions. And it is the kind the loud and the moneyed never have and cannot buy, and it outlasts them the way an honest joint outlasts a fancy lie. She came up my porch steps that first dawn with her shoes in her hands and creek water to her knees, and I opened the door and never asked her why. I want you to know I never did ask, not that morning nor any morning after. I did not need to. Some things you do not ask a person. You just open the door and put the kettle on and let the rest come as it will. And if you have lived right and quiet and asked nothing, sometimes the rest that comes is more than a man who thought himself nobody ever dared to hope for. She's on the porch now, as it happens. I can hear Boone's tail going. I'll leave off here and go let her in.